Part 1. The world before your comfort. Sit down. Be still a moment. Before you say a word about your hardships, the price of bread gone up a penny, the roof that leaks on a wet Tuesday, the fire that won't catch on a cold morning, sit down and be still. Because I am about to tell you of a world where the bread did not merely cost more, where there was no bread, where the river that fed 10,000 souls simply decided one year not to rise, and the people who depended on it did not write letters of complaint. They did not march in the streets with painted signs. They died, quietly, in the dark, in their homes. I have walked many a road, good fellow. I have slept under a forest canopy when the rain came sideways and the wind had teeth. I have eaten berries when there was nothing better, and nothing better was a long way off. But the men and women of the ancient world, Rome, Egypt, the islands of feudal Japan, they make my outlaw's life look like a feast at a lord's table. And that is saying something, because the lords I know keep poor tables indeed. This is not a list of facts. I have no patience for lists. Lists are what tax collectors make. This is a story, 3 stories, in truth, drawn from 3 corners of the world, each one true, each one earned in blood and dust, and the quiet desperation of people who had nothing but their wits and their will, and, if the gods were kind, a little grain hidden beneath the floorboards. What you're about to hear is not history as the scholars write it. Names of emperors, dates of battles, the rise and fall of dynasties that meant nothing to the man digging in the field. This is history as the man in the field lived it and survived it. Barely. Sometimes not at all.
What I am about to tell you is of the
Listen well. The world they woke into. Let us speak plainly of what life was in the ancient world, before we get to the particular horrors of particular places. You woke before dawn, not because you had somewhere to be, but because darkness after nightfall was a genuine danger. In Rome, the great city, the city that called itself the center of all things when the sun went down, the streets turned to traps. There were no lamps in the alleys. The watchmen were too few for too vast a city, and the darkness was not the soft, comfortable dark of a country night. It was the dark of thieves and open sewers, and the collapse of buildings that were never meant to stand as high as they were built. You lived, if you were a common person, in what the Romans called an insula, an island. It sounds almost pleasant, does it not? It was not pleasant. It was a building of 6, 7, sometimes 8 floors, built cheaply of wood and poorly fired brick, crammed with families on every level. And here is what you must understand. The higher you lived, the poorer you were, and the more danger you were in. The wealthy took the ground floors, spacious and aired, with water running below. You, if you were poor, climbed to the top. No water reached you there, no toilet, no natural light worth speaking of. In summer, the heat collected like water in a bowl. In winter, you had no fire, or if you had a small brazier, you were one accident from burning not merely yourself, but every family above and below you. Fire was the great terror of Rome. Not invasion, not plague, fire. And the poor ate rancid cereal. That is the truth of it. Not bread gone a day stale, cereal that had spoiled, gruel made from grain that smelled of rot. Because when you had nothing, spoiled food was still food. The wealthy had imported spices, reclining couches, slaves to fan them in summer. You had a bowl of something that would make a dog hesitate. Now take that life, that precarious, exhausting, dangerous life, and move it to Egypt, where everything depended on a river, where a river that rose too little meant the crops withered, where a river that rose too much drowned the fields and the people working them, where the margin between feast and famine was measured in the floodlines on a nilometer, and nobody had the power to change the floodlines. Not the farmers, not the governors, not even the pharaoh, though he would tell you otherwise. And then move it to Japan, where you could be a trained warrior, a man with a blade at his side and decades of discipline in his bones, and still find yourself without a master, without income, without a place in the rigid hierarchy of a society that valued your sword arm and nothing else about you. Where the code that governed your life demanded you die with honor if your lord died before you. And where, if you chose to live instead, the world treated you as a failure, a ghost, a man already dead who simply had not lain down yet. These are the three worlds we enter now. Let us begin in Rome. Part 2. The Insula on the 7th floor.
Let us
A Roman survival.
in Rome.
His name, as best the records suggest, was Marcus. Not the Marcus of the Senate, not the Marcus of the legions with a bright, polished breastplate. This was a different Marcus entirely, a fuller's apprentice in the 2nd century of the Common Era, living in the Suburra district of Rome, which was the kind of neighborhood that the wealthier Romans crossed carefully, in daylight, with company. The Suburra was the belly of Rome. It smelled like it too. Marcus was 23 years old, which in the Rome of his time meant he was already past the midpoint of what he could statistically expect from life. The average Roman at birth could expect perhaps 25 to 30 years, survive childhood, and that was no small feat. With infant mortality cutting through families like a scythe through wheat. And you might reach your 30s or 40s, if you were lucky. If disease did not find you first. If the building you lived in did not catch fire while you slept. Marcus had already lost 2 brothers, one to a fever that the physicians called by many names and understood not at all. One to a collapse not of the spirit, but of the actual floor of the insula where he had lodged, which gave way one evening when the timber had rotted too far, and the landlord had not thought it worth the cost of repair. This was not uncommon. In Rome, the insulae were built fast and built cheap, and the men who owned them cared more for the rent collected weekly from the desperate poor than for the structural integrity of the thing. A family that fell through a floor and died was simply replaced by the next family that needed a roof. Marcus paid his rent by the day. That is the truth of it. Not by the month, not by the year, but by the day. Because the poor of Rome could rarely look further forward than a day. You earned, you ate, you paid. If you did not earn, you did not eat. There was no other arrangement on offer. His work was in a fullery, one of the workshops that cleaned and processed the wool and cloth that kept Rome clothed. The process involved, among other things, treading cloth in great vats of human urine, which was collected from public urinals throughout the city. The Romans, nothing if not practical, had understood that urine contained ammonia, and ammonia cleaned cloth. So Marcus spent his working hours standing in other people's waste, treading cloth, breathing fumes, his feet permanently stained a peculiar gray yellow that no amount of washing at the public baths entirely removed. The baths, at least, were free, or nearly so. The emperors had understood some of them, in their better moments, that a populace with access to bathing was a slightly less miserable populace, and a slightly less miserable populace was less likely to riot. So the great bath complexes of Rome were open to all, women and men at separate hours, and for the price of a small coin, you could soak in heated water, use the latrines, and exist for an hour or two as something other than a beast of labor. But the baths were also where disease spread. The same water touched hundreds of bodies in a day. Tuberculosis moved through the warm, crowded rooms. Malaria came in from the marshes outside the city. Typhoid lurked in the water supply. Because even Rome's famous sewers, and they were for their time remarkable things, could not keep contamination entirely out of the water that fed the poorest quarters. The wealthy drank from better sources. Marcus drank what was available and thanked whatever gods he still believed in when it did not make him immediately ill. The night of the fire. In the third month of a particularly bad summer, a summer of drought and thin harvests and grain prices that climbed daily, Marcus woke to the smell of smoke. He was on the 7th floor. The fire had started, as fires often did, on one of the lower floors, where a cooking brazier had been left too close to a wooden partition. The wood caught. The building, as wooden buildings do, began to find its purpose as fuel rather than shelter. There were no fire brigades in the modern sense. The vigiles, the night watchmen who also served as firefighters, had buckets and wet rags and good intentions. And against a burning insula 7 stories tall, they were a cup thrown at a river. Their job in practice was often less to save the building than to prevent the fire from spreading to the next one. Marcus had no possessions worth naming. A sleeping mat, a bowl, a small clay lamp that had belonged to his mother. He took the lamp and ran. The stairs, one narrow staircase serving all 7 floors, were already thick with smoke and people. There is a particular kind of terror that belongs to a staircase filling with smoke, and bodies pressing in every direction. Some going down, some in panic going nowhere. Some already fallen and being stepped upon by those who came behind. Marcus knew it that night, the way you only know a thing when it is happening to you. He made it out. Not everyone did. He stood in the street of the Subura, at what he later recalled as the deepest part of the night, with nothing but a clay lamp, the clothes on his back, and the knowledge that the place he had called home, poor as it was, foul as it was, no longer existed. Around him, other families stood the same way. Children cried. An old woman sat on the cobblestones and did not move and did not speak, and seemed to have decided that the street was as good a place as any to stop. Marcus walked. There was little else to do. The night, as the scholars of his time described it, fell over the city like a great danger, and the streets were empty of lamps and full of the kind of people who thrive in darkness. He moved quickly and kept to the wider streets where the watchman's presence might offer some small protection. He had nothing worth stealing, which was perhaps its own form of safety. By morning, he had found a place in the portico of a temple, not from piety, but because the portico offered shelter, and the priests did not chase the destitute away before dawn. He spent 3 days there, eating what the city's dole could offer, which in a year of thin harvests was not much. The grain that was never enough. Here is a truth about Rome that the histories of great men tend to obscure. The city of 1,000,000 souls was perpetually on the edge of hunger. The grain supply the Annona administered by officials appointed for that purpose was the single mechanism standing between the Roman masses and starvation. It had to move by ship from the great grain-producing provinces of Egypt and North Africa, travel the length of the Mediterranean, arrive at the port of Ostia, and be hauled by barge up the Tiber to Rome itself. A late shipment, a storm at sea, a corrupt official diverting grain for his own profit, any of these things could tighten the supply, raise prices, and push the hundreds of thousands already living at the margin into genuine want. In the bad years, and there were many bad years, the price of bread climbed beyond what a man like Marcus earned in a day's fulling. And when a man cannot buy bread, he does not eat. And when he does not eat, his body begins to work against him. Malnutrition was not a crisis in Rome. It was a condition, a background state for the majority of the urban poor, a slow weakening that made them more vulnerable to the diseases that circulated through the crowded tenements and the public baths and the shared latrines. Marcus survived the fire. He found new lodging on the 5th floor of another insula, still high, still without water or toilet access, but slightly better than the 7th. He went back to the fullery. He paid his rent by the day. He ate what he could afford. He was, in the terms of his world, one of the fortunate ones. He lived. There is no dramatic moment of triumph in his story. no rescue, no reversal of fortune. The survival of a man like Marcus was simply the daily renegotiation of existence, not winning, but not losing. And the not losing being its own kind of victory when the alternative was so close. He was 23 years old, and already, by the standards of his world, a survivor. Part 3. When the river forgot to rise. An Egyptian survival. Egypt is older than Rome by 1,000 years and more. It was old when Rome was still a cluster of mud huts on 7 hills. And in all its long age, through every dynasty and every pharaoh, through war and peace and the slow turn of centuries, one thing remained absolutely constant. Everything depended on the Nile. Not mostly, not largely. Everything. The river rose each year in a flood that the Egyptians called the inundation. It came from the rains of distant Ethiopia, swollen and dark with rich silt, and it spread across the flat land of the delta and the valley and left behind, when it retreated, a layer of dark, fertile soil that grew the wheat and the barley that fed not merely Egypt, but much of the ancient Mediterranean world. The inundation was the pulse of Egyptian civilization. When it came correctly, not too high, not too low, but in that precise range the farmer needed, the land gave abundantly. The granaries filled. The kingdom breathed. When the flood failed, when the rains in distant Ethiopia did not come, or came too sparse, or came at the wrong time, the silt did not spread. The soil did not replenish. The crops came thin, or did not come at all. And then, Egypt, which had seemed so golden and permanent and eternal, discovered that it was as fragile as any other place where people live by the mercy of water. The woman at Deir el-Medina. Let us call her Neferit. The name means the beautiful one, and was common enough that we can use it without dishonesty. And the records of Deir el-Medina, the workers' village that housed the craftsmen who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, are detailed enough that the shape of her life can be reconstructed with reasonable confidence. She was a woman of the working class, which in Egypt meant a woman of the artisan class, which was not the lowest position, but was not comfortable either. Her husband was a tomb painter, a skilled man, trained in the precise and demanding work of covering stone walls with images that were meant to last eternity. And in the 13th century before the Common Era, under the later Ramesside pharaohs, the kingdom of Egypt was beginning to fray. Neferit's world was one of physical labor, chronic pain, and medical knowledge that combined genuine skill with superstition in proportions that sometimes helped and sometimes did not. The skeletal remains from Deir el-Medina tell their own story. High rates of arthritis in the spine and joints, the damage of a life bent over stone floors and rough work surfaces. Dental wear, severe enough to be agonizing, caused partly by the grit that inevitably found its way into the bread ground between millstones that shed tiny fragments of stone into the flour, which then wore down the teeth year by year until the roots were exposed and infection followed. A bad tooth in the ancient world was not merely a nuisance. It was a potential death sentence. The average life expectancy for an Egyptian woman of Neferit's class was perhaps 35 to 37 years. Not because they were weak, but because the world they lived in was ruthless to the body. Childbirth was a particular terror. Women who survived multiple pregnancies were fortunate. And puerperal fever, the infection that followed birth in unsanitary conditions, killed a significant number of those who survived the delivery itself. Neferit had survived 3 pregnancies. 2 of the children had survived childhood. 1 had not, had died in the 2nd year of a fever brought on by intestinal parasites, which were near universal in a population that waded through Nile floodwater every planting season and could not separate the water that fed their crops from the water that carried disease. The year the flood was wrong. The inscriptions of the period are careful in their omissions. Pharaohs did not record failure. The great stone walls of the temples speak of victory, of the Nile's bounty, of the gods' favor. But in the papyrus documents, the administrative records, the letters, the work logs, the grain receipts that survive from places like Deir el-Medina, a different picture emerges. There was a year when the flood did not come correctly. It came too low, which meant the silt spread too thin, which meant the fields on the margins of the farmable land received nothing. Those fields did not produce, and the fields that did produce produced less than expected because the soil was not replenished as it should have been. And the administrators of the nome, the administrative district, had to decide how to distribute grain that was not sufficient for the number of mouths that needed it. This was the world Neferet moved through. The records show that in such years, workers at Deir el-Medina, who were paid in grain, measured out as rations, received their rations late, sometimes weeks late, sometimes not at all, for a period that stretched into genuine hunger. The men who worked the royal tombs stopped work and sent their foremen to complain to the administrators. These complaints, some of the first recorded labor strikes in human history, survive in the papyri. They are quiet, formal, and utterly desperate. We have no rations. We cannot work. We are hungry. In the broader kingdom, in the years of failed floods, the situation was worse still. The tomb inscriptions of a governor named Anktifi from a period of collapse that preceded the Middle Kingdom record conditions that the governor himself describes with a plainness that needs no elaboration. All of Upper Egypt was dying of hunger. People wandered in search of food. They fought over water. There were reports, carved in stone by officials who themselves found the fact almost too terrible to record, of cannibalism, of people eating their children. Let me say that again, because it should not slide past. People eating their children. This is what a failed Nile flood could mean at its worst extreme. Not hunger, not discomfort, not a season of thin soup and earlier bedtimes. The complete dissolution of the order that holds human beings to their better natures, driven there by a river that simply did not rise high enough.
Should not slide past.
What Neferet knew. Neferet would not have experienced cannibalism. The village of Deir el-Medina had more protection than the general population. The workers there were skilled, valued, and the administration had some interest in keeping them alive. But she would have experienced the fear of it. She would have known, as every person in Egypt knew, that the margin between enough and nothing was the flood line on the Nilometer, and that nobody controlled the flood line. She would have known what happened to women when grain ran short, and the family had to choose who ate and who did not. She would have known that a sick child in a year of thin rations had a harder road than a sick child in a year of plenty. And she had already buried one child in a year of plenty. She would have known that the pharaoh, for all his divinity, for all the temples built in his name, the walls covered in images of his victories, could not make the river rise. The priests prayed to Khnum, who was said to control the Nile's source. Rituals were performed, offerings were made, and the river rose when it rose, and did not when it did not, indifferent to the prayers of the most powerful civilization on earth. Warm with hard-won wisdom. What she had was this: work. The work of feeding her remaining children, managing the household, stretching the grain ration through techniques of careful baking that made the bread go further. The work of maintaining the social relationships, the network of neighbors and extended family that in lean times allowed people to share what little they had. Because a person who shared in the good years could expect to receive in the bad ones. This was not generosity in the modern sentimental sense. It was survival technology.
Bread is more than food, child.
She had knowledge passed down through generations, which roots and plants could supplement the diet when grain was scarce, which foods could be stretched, which illnesses responded to which herbs. The physicians of Deir el-Medina were real practitioners who treated broken bones with splints and infections with specific remedies. And even they understood that some conditions were beyond their treatment. A woman needed to know the difference between what could be cured and what had to be endured.
The splint and the amulet are real to these people.
She
There's only one
endured.
truly works for mending the
This
world.
is the sum of it, not heroism in the storybook sense, not a great battle or a clever stratagem, but the daily endurance of a life that was simultaneously rich in human meaning and brutally indifferent to human welfare. She loved her children. She worked her body to early arthritis. She feared the flood. She prayed and did not know if the prayer reached anyone.
Heroism. The daily
She survived the year the flood was wrong. Her children survived.
not
It was
heroism.
enough.
The daily
Part 4.
endurance of a life.
The Road of the Wandering Man, a Japanese survival. In the language of Japan, the word Ronin is made of two characters. The first means wave. The second means man. A wave man. A man adrift. It is a good name for what it describes. A samurai without a master was not merely unemployed. He was a man whose entire identity, whose honor, purpose, social standing, daily structure, and reason for rising in the morning had been swept away by the tide of circumstances beyond his control. His name was Kenji. Not a famous Ronin, not one of the celebrated 47 who avenged their lord and became legend. He was an ordinary man, a lower-ranking samurai of the Edo period, living in the early 18th century when the long peace of the Tokugawa shogunate had created a particular and cruel problem. The world no longer needed warriors, but the warriors still existed, trained from childhood for a purpose that peace had made obsolete. His lord had died. Not in battle. There were no battles worth speaking of in the Edo peace. His lord had died of illness, old age, and the accumulated weight of a quiet life. And because the succession was complicated, because there was dispute and administrative difficulty, the domain was not smoothly passed on in the way that would have preserved the positions of those who served it. Kenji found himself, at the age of 31, without a master, without a stipend, without a place in the rigid hierarchy that organized every aspect of Japanese society. He was now a Ronin, a wave man, adrift. The weight of shame. Understand what this meant. From the moment of his birth, Kenji had been shaped by a code, the Bushido, the way of the warrior, that told him exactly who he was and what he owed and to whom. He owed his lord everything, his skill, his body, his death if necessary. In return, the lord provided land, stipend, protection, identity. The exchange was not equal in power. A samurai was a servant, however honored, but it was a known exchange, a stable one, a structure within which a man could know himself. Without the lord, the code had specific instructions. A samurai whose lord died was expected to follow him to perform seppuku, the ritual disembowelment that was considered the honorable death of a warrior. Not every samurai did this. Most did not. But the code said they should, and the society around them believed they should, and the fact of their continued existence was therefore a standing accusation of cowardice. Every morning that Kenji woke was, by the rigid standards of his world, evidence of his failure.
Their lives are forfeit.
This is not a small thing to carry. It is not a burden that diminishes with time or familiarity. The shame of the Ronin was structural, built into the system in which he had to continue to live. Other samurai would not meet his eyes. Daimyo, who might have employed him, viewed him with suspicion, wondering why he had not served his master in death, wondering what such a man might do when the next crisis came. The rigid class system of the Edo period had pushed him into a category that sat just below the farmer class, which was itself below the samurai, and above only the outcasts and criminals. He was, in the eyes of the society that had formed him, already a kind of ghost. The economics of honorable poverty. A Ronin without employment had no income. This is obvious. but its implications were less obvious to those who had never had to think about it. The samurai class had always been paid in rice, measured stipends of grain that served as the currency of their status. Without a lord, there was no stipend. Without the stipend, there was nothing. Some Ronin became teachers to martial arts schools that trained the sons of merchants and minor officials who aspired to the samurai aesthetic without the samurai lineage. This was work Kenji was capable of, and it kept him alive. But it was work that required contacts, a reputation, a location in a city large enough to have students. And in the rigid geography of the Edo period, where samurai were expected to live in designated districts of castle towns, a Ronin could find himself without even the right to occupy the space where such students might find him. He taught what he knew. He taught swordsmanship to young men whose fathers were merchants, which was a particular irony, since the merchant class sat below farmers in the official hierarchy, and Kenji was teaching men his society considered his social inferiors the skills that had defined his superiority. He did not remark on this irony. One does not when one needs to eat. The economics were unforgiving. His teaching income was irregular. Students came when they could afford it, left when they could not. And the seasons of the year brought their own disruptions. He lived in a single room in a part of the city that the wealthier samurai did not visit, in conditions that would have been familiar to the Roman plebeian: cramped, ill-lit, cold in winter, oppressively hot in the summer, shared walls with neighbors whose lives pressed uncomfortably close through the thin partitions. He carried his swords, still, the two blades that were the mark of his rank, the daisho, the long and short together. This was both his identity and his burden. The swords cost money to maintain. The traditional dress of a samurai cost money he did not have. To appear as anything less was to lose the last formal marker of what he had been. But to maintain the appearance required money that he spent on appearances rather than food. This is a trap that history has set for many a proud man.
It is enough.
And it does not become less of a trap for being recognized. The famine year. In 1783, a volcano erupted on the distant island of Iceland, an event that had nothing to do with Japan and everything to do with what happened to Japan next. The eruption of Laki sent clouds of sulfur dioxide across the northern hemisphere, disrupting weather patterns, cooling temperatures, causing the monsoon rains of East Asia to arrive late and thin. The summer of 1783 and the years that followed it were lean ones across much of the world. In Japan, it was a disaster. The rice harvest, the foundation of the entire economy, the substance of samurai stipends and peasant meals alike, failed across significant portions of the country. The Great Tenmei Famine, as it is known to history, killed somewhere between 200,000 and 1 million people across the decades of its worst effects. Peasants starved, villages emptied. People ate grass and roots and bark and each other in the extremity of it. Kenji was in the city when the famine began to bite. The price of rice climbed with the speed of a thing that has been held down and suddenly released. His teaching income, already thin, became thinner. The families of his students were themselves struggling. And the education of a son in the martial arts is among the first luxuries to be abandoned when a family is choosing between the lesson and the meal. He watched the Ronin around him because he was not the only one. There were thousands like him. The peacetime overflow of a military system that had produced warriors for a world that no longer needed them in such numbers. And he saw what they became when the hunger came. Some became bandits, falling entirely out of the code that had shaped them into something that the code would not recognize. Some attached themselves to the peasant uprisings that the famine sparked, becoming swords for hire in disturbances that the shogunate would later suppress. Some simply disappeared into poverty, so complete it left no record. The authorities in Edo feared these wandering warriors with particular intensity during famines. A hungry Ronin with a sword and nothing to lose was, as the records of the period note, a problem that could not be easily solved by the mechanisms available to a rigid and bureaucratic system. Kenji did not become a bandit. He reduced his eating first, then further. He sold the better of his 2 swords, which was itself a kind of death, the amputation of part of his identity. But an identity is a luxury when you are choosing between honor and starvation, and even the most rigid code bends under genuine hunger. He kept the short blade, the wakizashi, and sold the long sword to a dealer who would eventually sell it again to a merchant's family seeking the appearance of warrior lineage. He ate less. He taught where he could. He endured what the famine brought, and waited with the patience of a man who has understood that there is very little alternative to patience when the world has arranged itself against you. The famine eased. The rains returned. The rice came in again. And Kenji, thinner and older, and without the sword that had marked his rank, was still alive. Not flourishing, not redeemed, not returned to anything like the position he had held before. Alive. Part 5. What they knew that we have forgotten. I have told you 3 stories. A Roman fuller who survived a fire, an Egyptian woman who survived a drought, a Japanese Ronin who survived a famine. None of them are famous. None of them left monuments with their names carved large. History, as it is usually written, did not think they were worth the attention. But I am an outlaw of the greenwood, and I have always had more interest in the men who dig the earth than in the men who rule it. And what I see, looking at these 3 lives, is not tragedy, though there is plenty of that, and not heroism, though there is some of that too. What I see is something simpler and more important than either. I see what it actually took to live. Not to win, not to achieve, not to rise above one's circumstances in the satisfying way of the story where the poor boy becomes a king, just to continue to be alive in a world that was genuinely and constantly trying to kill you through fire and flood and famine and disease, and the structural cruelty of systems that valued your labor and cared nothing for your welfare.
Listen closely. We have enough supplies.
The skills of survival.
The rendezvous point is there.
The poor of ancient Rome understood fire. They understood it the way people understand things that have already hurt them, not as an abstract danger, but as a specific, personal enemy with a face and a history. They knew which buildings were older and drier. They knew which neighbors were careless with cooking fires. They knew the sound of a fire starting in the walls before it came through, and they knew the route to the street, and they kept that route clear in their minds, the way a sensible person keeps a map. Because the map might be the difference between standing in the street with a clay lamp and not standing anywhere at all. The people of Egypt understood water. They understood the Nile the way a farmer understands weather, not with the false confidence of mastery, but with the deep attention of someone whose life depends on accurate observation. They watched the flood line with the intensity that their descendants now watch stock markets. They built grain stores. They rationed. They networked the community structures that allowed grain to move from households with a little more to households with a little less. Were not charity. They were infrastructure, as important as any canal or dam. And they functioned because everyone understood that the bad years came for everyone eventually, and the debt would be repaid.
Sometimes you're pushed out.
The Ronin of Japan understood adaptability in a society that was designed specifically to prevent it. The rigid hierarchy of feudal Japan told every person exactly where they stood and what they were permitted to be. The Ronin had been thrown out of that hierarchy and had to find a way to exist in the gaps, to use the skills they had in contexts those skills had not been designed for. To accept the loss of status while preserving enough of the identity that the loss did not destroy them entirely. To keep moving when the code they had been given said they should be still and permanent and dead. All 3 learned the same fundamental lesson from very different directions. The system will not save you. The pharaoh does not control the Nile. The emperor does not control the fire. The shogunates does not care about the hunger of a Ronin. The gods you pray to are listening to a great many prayers at once, and they have their own concerns. What saves you, not always, not in every case, but more often than not, is the quality of your attention to the actual conditions of your life. Not the conditions as you wish they were, or as the powerful tell you they are, but as they actually are. The floor that is rotting, the flood that is coming too thin, the purse that will not stretch to the next payment. What we have forgotten. We are, in our age, extraordinarily safe by the standards of Marcus and Neferet and Kenji. I say this not to diminish your troubles. I know well that trouble is trouble, whatever century it falls in, and a man with a leaking roof is still wet, even if the Roman in the burning Insula was wetter. I say it because the forgetting of how bad it was is itself a kind of danger. When we forget what the old world demanded of ordinary people just to keep breathing, we lose our measure of what human beings are capable of enduring and adapting to and surviving.
There is only one path forward.
The people of the ancient world were not more heroic than you are. They were not stronger or harder or less afraid. They felt fear the way you feel fear, and they felt grief the way you feel grief. And they wanted safety and food and shelter and the company of people who cared for them the same way you want those things. The difference is only that they had far less, and they survived anyway. Not all of them. Let us be honest, many did not. Many went down in the fires and the famines and the floods and the systems that valued them only as labor. Many died in the insulae they could not afford to leave. Many starved when the Nile failed. Many rotted away in the shame and poverty of the Ronin's road. But enough survived. Enough kept going, kept negotiating, kept finding the angle from which the impossible became merely very difficult. Enough that the species continued and built, and eventually produced a world in which you and I can sit at a remove from fire and drought and have this conversation. That is the inheritance. Not the pyramids, impressive as they are. Not the Roman roads, useful as they were. Not the blades of the samurai, beautiful as they can be. The inheritance is the stubbornness, the specific, unglamorous, day after day stubbornness of ordinary people who had every reason to give up and did not. A final word from the forest. I am a man of the greenwood. I have no palace and no throne, and no claim to teach history as the scholars teach it. But I have lived rough enough to know what rough living costs, and I have met enough men and women in desperate straits to know that desperation is not the end of the story unless you make it so. Marcus lit his lamp and kept it. Neferet baked her bread and stretched it. Kenji sold his sword and lived without it. None of them changed the world. None of them made the bad years better by the force of their will. The fire still burned, the river still failed, the rice still rotted in the fields. But they were there, on the other side of it. And here you are, on the other side of them. It were never the use in our country to lose the thread of those who came before. Their hardship is the ground beneath your feet. Tread it with some gratitude. Now enough sitting. There is work to be done.